If there's one thing to point out about all these crazy far-right wingers, is that they do constantly follow this free market fundamentalist ideology that no matter what happens, no matter what mistake goes wrong, they were always right. That's why Liz Truss still to this day thinks that everything that she was doing, even though she had pretty much crashed the gilt market, which was going to render some of the UK's biggest pension companies bankrupt. And always remember, if the Bank of England had not stepped in, things could have been so much worse. Like, we got off easy. We got off easy. Could have been infinitely worse. You look at what's going on in America with Doge. You'll notice a lot of right-wing UK people gone very quiet on Doge because it hasn't exactly worked out. Doge. And then you go and look at Argentina with Milei in charge. And you talk about, oh, look at Milei's economic miracle. Now, you look at the numbers, you do a little digging, and you realize that's not the case. Why is Milei had to take out one of the highest loans from the World Bank? That's because he's trying to dollarize the economy. That's because he's run out of physical currency. His economic idea isn't exactly working out either. Neither are some of his policies having, well, very good economic results. And Milei's popularity is going off a cliff slowly but steadily. And while they talk about Milei now, the second things start to really go wrong in Argentina, or if someone were to actually really challenge them on like Question Time or something about that, about Milei's activities in Argentina, I think they would stop talking about it very quickly. Because quite frankly, you can shut anyone talking down about Milei and his supposed economic genius by simply asking them where he gets that economic genius. Because as I've told you on this channel, he gets it by going to have a seance with his dead dog. And yet, every single time you say this, you talk about this, I do not see anyone advocating for someone like Kemi Badenoch or Nigel Farage to start holding their own seances to contact Milei's dead dog as well, so that they too can receive economic advice, because quite frankly, it would be ludicrous to do so. And in the wake of Farage, the local elections where, Reform UK did all right. Not well, but it did all right. If you really look at the big picture of things. He's now put out a manifesto in the Daily Mail, of all places, but there you go. And what has happened now is The Economist had a look at it. They had a look at it, and they have turned around and they've said, that's a disaster. That is an absolute disaster you are advocating for. You want to be like the next prime minister, and that's the economic plan you are pushing? That is economic disaster on a scale even Liz Truss could not dream up. So let's dive into what The Economist had to say about Reform's economic plans, because I think a lot of people might be suddenly quite turned off when they realise that Farage's economic plans are pretty much Liz Truss on steroids. So before we do get on into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button down below. Of course, there are links to my Patreon page, the one foundation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can all buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there's the Pony Club down below as well. So, as always, let's crack on then into this. So, it's coming from The Economic, with Nigel Farage's economic plans are a disaster. So, when Reform UK first sent 5 members of Parliament to 5 members now to Parliament last July, Nigel Farage's populist party's leader called it now a bridgehead. The thumping wins across England's local elections on May not, of course, the next stage now of this assault. Now Reform is neck and neck with Labour in the polls. Success, of course, means scrutiny, and as a protest party, Reform, like earlier Farage ventures, was distinctively mainly by a perchance for scandal and an uncanny ability to nudge the Tories now into enforced errors. Now the notion that Reform could actually be a serious party of government no longer seems fanciful. Its ideas should be taken seriously. Unfortunately, now this mismatch now on offer is so far is highly alarming. Reform's policies add up to an agenda now of fiscal recklessness that rivals and may very well exceed the disastrous 49-day hair-raising market tanking premiership of Liz Truss back in 2022. And yet, people want this. People want Farage because they'll think, oh, he'll be good. When you've got The Economist saying this is going to make Liz Truss' little economic experiment look like a blip. Yeah, I think that should be bad. That should be at least raising a lot of alarm bells for you guys, don't you think? Don't you think so? Anyway, Reform's manifesto from the 2024 election is a starting point. The party has now since crab walked away from the document, but it remains now the only entry under policies on its website. More tellingly, of course, Farage has now specifically reaffirmed or even expanded on nearly half of the tax cuts listed now in recent months. The manifesto puts Reform's giveaways at £140 billion. That's 5% of GDP per year, but claims now to offset them with savings worth 160 billion. Even on a generous but realistic accounting, The Economist has estimated that the annual costs for savings are in the region of 200 billions, and the saving gap would be around 100 billion. The gap now between the two would amount now to a colossal fiscal shock, blowing up the deficit and straining the gilt market to its limit. Bear in mind, that's what happened to Liz Truss. And this isn't just Liz Truss, playing here. This is Nigel Farage throwing a grenade at our economy and saying, gee, isn't this going to be fun, guys? I keep on saying this, and I'll say this before. These Reform people are lunatics. When they have an inch of power, they're going to be an absolute disaster. They're in the councils now. They're already doing so. You've got the guy who's in charge of Pinhole. He has no idea what he is doing. He's got to set up a combined regional mayoral authority. He has no idea what he's doing. And yet people thought it would be a good idea to put a guy who has absolutely no political experience in doing this into position. Anyway, back to this. So, why, of course, the mismatch? Take the taxes first. These changes are so vast that the precise costings are futile. But Reform has made seriously generous guesses. The party claims that its personal tax cuts cost 70 billion a year. But the proposed now lift to the income tax thresholds alone would at least cost that much, probably more, based on the rules of thumb from HMRC, the tax agency, adding now to the cuts to the fuel duty, stamp duty, VAT, inheritance tax, and more will add tens of billions. Recently, Farage has now even doubled down on his single now costliest pledge to lift the personal allowance for income tax from 12,000 to 20,000, and he now wants to fully abolish inheritance tax. The manifesto promises businesses £18 billion of giveaways too. But the promise now to cut corporation tax by 10% points alone is now worth double that. And this is what a lot of these right wingers don't seem to understand. If you lower taxes or you raise an amount where people no longer have to pay stuff, where does that money go? Because that doesn't go into the government's pockets, doesn't go into their finances to fund all these public services that people want. It's not how it happens, but this is their ideology, this free market fundamentalist ideology that basically says if you don't tax people, somehow economic miracles, economic magic never happened. No country has ever done it. No country has ever gone through it or even tried to do it. What happened to Liz Truss? Why do you think Liz Truss only lasted 49 days? Anyway, so the realistic take then from one of now Reform's own main revenue raisers, dropping now some interest payments on the Bank of England's reserves, is just a mere fraction of the 35 billion stated. When it comes to, of course, spending, Reform wants 30 to 40 billion pounds more spent on health, defence, and fighting crime. To pay now and cover these tax cuts, the party has to rely on hand waving and austerity. Questionably, now it asserts that its policies will add 1 percentage point to growth and near doubling now the take of 1 million of Britain's off benefits. In addition, it suggests that a 5% cut across the government austerity, not far off, of course, of the 2010s, puts now an unfathomably vast savings now from ending net zero. Again, that would be a disaster ending all that stuff, but there you go. Delivering, of course, even the viable cuts would, of course, be very hard. Reform's leaders, of course, act very Thatcherite, but many of their voters are now even big staters. Again, very true. Like people, I don't know if politicians have realized just how like big state the electorate is in the UK. This, of course, early test was Labour's, of course, cuts to the winter fuel payments, a unnecessary subsidy now to richer pensioners. Reform now has very largely campaigned to restore them. Outside of the tax and spend, its now wider agenda of net zero migration and expensively buying electricity pylons, burying electricity pylons is now even is hardly, of course, even more promising. The general election is, of course, still years away, but at some point sooner, the infrastructure investors that Labour hopes it will too start pricing now in the risk that Reform could be a very serious about implementing all those ideas. Britain now has to keep these bond vigilantes outside to fund its borrowing habit. Truss's recklessness and the whole Brexit saga have already very much strained the patience. More such episodes would start to look like not like aberrations, but like parts of a pattern. Even the man that Farage calls himself his friend in Washington is starting now match with the bond markets over tariffs. Reform now has 4 years to actually choose now between a very serious rethink or a risk now of financial calamity if it wins. Maybe being no hopers wasn't so bad after all. I think that just goes to show you it all. The whole idea that Farage and these people getting in would be somehow good. It's not. It would be a financial disaster. Be an absolute disaster for the UK. Completely, utterly ruinous. And I will say this now, I will not be surprised if some of these reform councils go bankrupt, go belly up, because of the amount of ridiculousness they get up to. And trust me, they're already starting. So let's crack on then into something else later. But oh wow, yeah. And yet people still think this guy is like the savior of the UK. When you've got The Economist, which bear in mind isn't left wing, it's quite right wing when it comes to his economic analysis. When they're coming out and saying, yeah, this is bad, it's worse than Liz Truss. Not only that, you are going to cause huge problems for like future generations, future governments because of this. Because Labour has managed to sort of very much, stabilize the boat when it comes to the financial situation, where we are seeing now companies and people want to come back and invest in the UK slowly but surely. When you've got someone like potential like Nigel Farage on the horizon, where it could just rock the boat completely and just blow it up. Yeah, it'll end in absolute disaster. It'll end in an absolute disaster. But anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.